right, great, thank you. So yeah, I mean, as we've kind of learned, and as we know from just being outside, anytime we're outdoors in Maine in particular, we're going to face an onslaught of biting pests, whether it be the mosquitoes and black flies and horse flies that we've always known, or now ticks. So I work at the Diagnostic and Research Lab in Orono, and specifically in the tick lab, where we are doing research and monitoring the activity and distribution of ticks here in the state of Maine. So what we do here is part of the program is offering a service to the people of Maine where you can send in ticks to have them identified to species or tested for some of the commonly transmitted tick-borne pathogens here in Maine. So of the 50,000 reported cases of vector-borne disease in the US, ticks are actually the causal vector of almost 95% of those. They're not insects, even though they have that same appearance, but they're actually a blood-feeding arachnid that's similar to the mite. There's been roughly 900 tick species that have been identified across the globe, and over 90 species that have been identified here in the US. In Maine, we have 15 species that have been found, and it could be as many as 17 species. But these 15 species have actually been identified here in the state of Maine. Some come into the state on migratory wildlife or by other means and are unable to establish long-term populations, whereas other species are now endemic and have spread throughout much of the state. The most commonly encountered species in Maine include the deer tick, American dog tick, and the woodchuck tick. Now, the deer tick is also known as the black-legged tick. The black-legged tick is kind of the accepted common name for that species, but it is highly regional here in Maine. The vast majority of people refer to this species, Ixodes scapularis, as the deer tick. So to try and minimize confusion, I'll be referring to that species as the deer tick throughout this presentation today. So these three species, as I said, are the most commonly encountered species that we do have here. By far and away, the deer tick and the dog tick are the two of the three that we're most likely to encounter. We are relatively fortunate with the American dog tick that it's not known to transmit pathogens here as of yet. And I say as of yet because it is capable of transmitting the causative agent of Rocky Mountain spotted fever in other parts of the country, including southern New England. And so this is a pathogen that we are interested in and that we are now testing for as kind of a proactive step to see if and when it does start to occur here in Maine. So really the main focus is on the deer tick. The deer tick is the primary vector of Lyme disease, as well as several of our other pathogens that we do have here. The woodchuck tick, as I said, is also commonly found, but to a lesser extent than the other two commonly encountered species. And this one is a little bit more host specific. It does seem to prefer to feed on those kind of small to medium-sized animals, woodchucks, raccoons, skunks, things like that. But if you consider where those animals are found, it's often around, dwellings and human establishments and places like that, basically around the yard. So we do certainly encounter that species fairly frequently as well. So ticks can be very difficult to kind of tell apart from one another. These are just some shots of the two most commonly encountered species here in Maine, the deer tick and the dog tick. A lot of the features that are shown on these slides are not really easily visible to the naked eye. They do require a microscope to really get a good look and be able to differentiate. However, there are some features here that can be seen with the naked eye and really make identifying, particularly between these two species, much easier. For instance, this kind of circular plate on the back of the adult female deer tick, and both of these are adult females, both the deer tick and the dog tick in these photos. But this circular plate here is called the scutum or dorsal shield, and you see that the dog tick has one as well. On the deer tick, it's a round or oval shaped circle. It's really kind of dark brown or black in color, whereas on the dog tick, it's really this kind of ornate, mottled, kind of creamy whitish color. So just, you know, from a quick glance looking at these two species, you can really differentiate based specifically on that one feature alone. Now that said, there are a host of other features that are shown here that can be used to differentiate, but those two, looking at that kind of spot on the back of the tick is really the easiest to tell the two apart. Now, as Dr. Santier mentioned, once we get into the species that are closely related to the deer tick, identification does get a little bit more tricky. Now, looking at these two pictures, a deer tick on the right, woodchuck tick on the left, they certainly look different. The woodchuck tick in this photo, has started to feed, so the color has started to shift, and that's why color can be a really difficult thing to look at in the body of the tick. As they start to feed, the color of the tick can really change dramatically. In this case, they both started out as kind of a tannish red color. As they feed, the ticks can become a tan or even kind of a slate blue color. So as I said, color alone can be a little bit of a misconceiving feature to examine. Again, looking at that dorsal shield, that scutum, shape is important. On the deer tick, it has this nice round black or dark brown scutum, whereas on the woodchuck tick, it has this kind of angular spade-shaped scutum. So another feature to look at. Again, these species can be very difficult to differentiate, so certainly sending them in for identification is recommended. Now, another type of tick that we are starting to see that Dr. Santier also mentioned is the Lone Star tick. Now, the Lone Star tick is primarily found in the southeast, along the mid-Atlantic, and now more and more so up in the northeast and southern New England. Here at the lab, we do receive several, up to a dozen or so of these type of tick each year, and a lot of those have actually originated from people who have acquired them here in Maine. They haven't traveled out of state or anything like that. So they are making their way into the state. The question is, are they becoming established? Are they reproducing and setting up populations here? And that still remains unclear whether that's taking place or not. But as B mentioned, this is a tick that's known to transmit a number of pathogens throughout its home range, as well as it's the causative organism of a specific allergic reaction to red meat called alpha-gal allergy, which is a relatively unique thing that an arthropod is causing a specific allergy to a food. So the size of the tick is really quite important, just because it makes it very difficult to find ticks on the body. As B mentioned, the nymphal stage of the deer tick, or black-legged tick as it's labeled here, is about the size of a poppy seed. That larval tick that has just emerged from the egg is about the size of a period at the end of your normal kind of size 12 font sentence. The adults are about 1/8 of an inch in length, so really quite small and really difficult to find potentially when you are conducting those tick checks. Dog ticks are a little bit larger, particularly in the adult stages, but still relatively small comparatively. So like some of the other pests, there are certain cues that we give off that can kind of stimulate tick activity. The CO2 that we breathe out, heat, just our movement, things like that can kind of stimulate the activity of ticks. Unlike some of those other biting pests that we encounter, ticks don't jump, they don't fly, they don't hop. They're kind of stationary in the vegetation in that they can only really kind of crawl up and down. They do undergo 3 active life stages, a larval, nymphal, and adult stage, and they'll feed 1 time during each of those stages. So basically from hatching from the egg up through mating, breeding, laying eggs, and dying, those ticks will feed 3 separate times on 3 separate hosts. They can go several months, potentially up to a year, without feeding at all. When they do finally feed, they can increase their body weight 200 to 600 times. And you can see in this photo on the bottom, this is an adult female deer tick prior to feeding, and then an adult female deer tick after feeding. So they really do increase their size dramatically as they take that blood meal. So here we have just kind of the business end of the tick, if you will, the mouth parts. So there's kind of a common misconception about tick feeding and what actually takes place. There's this misconception that the ticks will actually kind of burrow into the body, when in reality, the only part that's being inserted into the body is this part of the mouth part here called the hypostome. And you can see it has these little almost fishhook-like barbs that help anchor the tick to the host. They'll also secrete an anticoagulant that helps the blood continue to flow. They secrete an anesthetic that helps the bite site go unnoticed. They also can secrete these glue-like substances that also help them stay attached. They do have these kind of interesting mechanisms that help them continue to feed and help them go unnoticed by the host, whether it be an animal or a person. So as I said, that only part of the tick that's being inserted is that tiny hypostome, that little part of the mouth part. But looking at these photos, you can kind of understand why the impression is that ticks are burrowing into the body. I mean, it certainly looks from these photos that these ticks are really kind of getting down underneath the skin surface and kind of working their way inside the body. What's really happening here is just some localized swelling around the bite site. So the skin is kind of swelling up around the tick, not the tick going inside the body itself. So again, it's just that kind of small mouth part that's being inserted, not the entire tick itself. So the deer tick in particular undergoes a 2-year life cycle in which it feeds on those 3 hosts that I mentioned. Starting here in the spring of year 1, the female will lay her eggs off host down in the leaf litter. Later that summer, the six-legged larvae emerge, and then they'll quest to try and find their first host, which is often a small mammal, mice, chipmunk, squirrels, and in some cases, birds. And it's generally from feeding on this first host that they pick up the pathogens that they can later transmit. Lyme disease and the majority of tick-borne illnesses are not passed transovarially down from the mother to the offspring. There are a couple that can be transmitted in that way, but for the most part, Lyme disease and the other highly reported and common tick-borne pathogens, anaplasmosis, babesiosis, are not transmitted from mother down to the offspring. So they have to feed on an infected animal to pick up these pathogens. So again, it's generally during this first feeding that takes place. Once that larvae is fed, it'll drop off, molt into a nymph. Those nymphs will overwinter kind of in a state of dormancy down in the leaf litter underneath the snow. They emerge the following spring and early summer, and really start to peak in activity during midsummer, looking for their second host. Following that feeding on that second host, they'll drop off, molt into an adult, and then look for their third and final host. And that third and final host is often a deer. It is a preferred host. It is a reproductive host where the male and female ticks can find each other and mate and begin the life cycle all over again. Now, because of this 2-year cycle, there are certain times of the year when we see the different life stages of the deer tick. And that's kind of what this graph on the right is showing. We see a significant peak in adult activity in the fall. They've just molted from nymphs into adults. They're looking for that third and final blood meal. They're looking for a mate. So we see really high activity from kind of late September through October, November, even into December if weather permits. The ticks that don't find a host in the fall will overwinter, reemerge in the spring, and that's why we see this kind of second smaller peak in the spring of adult activity. It's those adults that are kind of desperately trying to find that host and find that mate to continue the life cycle. Again, as I mentioned, the nymphs, their activity peaks midsummer, so late June through July, and then the larvae are most active in August. The larvae really stay fairly low in the vegetation and do seem to prefer relatively small hosts So we don't see them on people very often. So it's a little bit of a lesser concern, the larvae themselves. Now, during the winter months, it's kind of, everyone's, put their bug spray away. They're not thinking about mosquitoes and black flies or anything anymore. There's snow on the ground. Ticks can actually become active basically any time that the temperature reaches freezing, and particularly active once it reaches 40 degrees. So if we have stretches during the winter months that are getting above freezing and getting to that 40-degree mark, we can and sometimes do see deer ticks becoming active and getting on people and pets and other animals. This past year, for instance, this past winter, we had several stretches from December all the way into February and March where we had a few days here and there, or a week at a time, where we were reaching 40 and even 50 degrees during the winter months. And we were receiving tick samples throughout that time period. I think from December through March, there was not a single week that we didn't receive at least one tick sample. So they were particularly active this past winter based on the winter temperatures that we did experience here in Maine. Now, where you're most likely to encounter a tick kind of varies depending on the species of tick that we're dealing with. Some of those ticks that I showed in that one of those first slides are very host specific. They feed on a specific type of wild animal and are associated kind of with the nests or burrows of those animals, and we don't really see them other places, whereas others can be really relatively spread out across the landscape. In general, they're found low to the ground, kind of waist height and below. And this is another common misconception, is that ticks will actually be dropping from tree branches onto people's heads. And I think part of the misconception lies in that when a tick gets on the body, it does have this kind of natural instinct to move up. So we do often find them on the head and around the hairline and the neck. And then people, in finding them in those places, they recall, brushing against or bumping their head on a tree branch and assume it must have been that. When in reality, the ticks are staying low to the ground, trying to increase their chances of any type of host walking by. So it's kind of those types of areas, particularly in forested areas. The deer tick dries out really quite easily, so it needs areas that have a lot of shade, can retain a lot of moisture, where there's a lot of leaf litter. So areas that can kind of hold that leaf litter, stone walls and wood piles, places like that, where there's tall grass, where there's brush, any area where there's kind of ground cover plants that can offer that protection are potential habitat for deer ticks in particular. Now, the dog ticks are a little bit more hardy. They can be found in some more exposed areas where the deer tick doesn't survive. But for the most part, the ticks in general do dry out quite easily and really kind of need some of these shaded and more humid, moist habitats. Now, as I said, they don't jump, they don't hop. In order to find a host, they exhibit a behavior that's known as questing. It's a really simple behavior. They simply walk out to the end of a piece of low-lying vegetation, and they just sit there and kind of swing their two front legs around, waiting for a host to walk by and brush against that vegetation. Once that happens, they'll start crawling around the body and look for a suitable place to begin feeding. Now, I mentioned that they do respond to CO2 and movement and those types of things, and it's not so much in that they respond by chasing us down or anything, though the Lone Star tick is a little bit more aggressive and does kind of follow cues like that. But the deer tick and the dog tick are just kind of laying in wait in the vegetation. And when they do sense a host, they kind of get ready and start to swing those front legs and ready themselves for something to brush past. Now, what that host could be, again, varies depending on the species. The dog tick and the deer tick are both generalist feeders. They feed on a really broad variety of hosts, anything from wild animals, small animals, large mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians even. That can include domestic animals, so our pets, livestock, and of course, people as well. Now, as far as their effect on wild animals, it tends to be relatively negligible. The deer tick does not tend to have a huge impact on its wildlife host. The pathogens that it carries don't seem to be a huge issue for deer or for mice or for other wildlife hosts either. While they can, severe infestations can potentially cause some issues, particularly if it's around the eyes or things like that, or some secondary infections. For the most part, as I said, the ticks themselves are not having a huge impact on the health of wild animals. Now that said, there is one situation where that's not the case, and that's winter ticks and moose. Now winter ticks are not a problem for people, and I did just get done talking all about the 3 different hosts. Well, this type of tick is a little bit different in that it gets on the moose as a larval tick, something that's just emerged from the egg, and it stays on that moose for its entire life throughout the winter. And it also quests a little bit different. So those other ticks, the deer ticks, the dog ticks, are kind of on their own. They're just individually questing in the vegetation, whereas these winter tick larvae will actually cluster together in groups of up to a couple thousand potentially. So when that moose walks by and brushes against that vegetation, a couple of those ticks grab on, and all the other ticks hold on to each other, and the moose pulls a chain of a couple hundred to a couple thousand ticks on in one fell swoop. And that can result in some really severe infestations, tens of thousands, even up to 100,000 of these winter ticks on a single animal. This can cause anemia, hair loss from trying to scratch and rub the ticks off of the body, distraction from feeding. And this is all taking place during the winter when the moose really needs all the resources it can muster to survive. So it can really have some potentially devastating impacts on moose populations as a whole across their range. Back to the deer tick, it is expanding its range. As you can see here, it is found basically throughout the eastern United States. There's another type of tick that causes Lyme disease in the western United States along the west coast, something called the western black-legged tick. So it is basically a nationwide issue at this point, as B was alluding to. And here in Maine, it's no different. During the late 80s, early 90s, we really started to see a large influx in the number of deer ticks being found in Maine. Our first reported case of Lyme disease occurred in 1986. Basically since then, ticks have become well established in the southern half of the state. This map on the right just shows our submission data of deer ticks for last year alone, 2019. You can really see just kind of that geographic spread. We do find ticks as far north as Fort Kent, Madawaska, far north in Aroostook County, just in much lower numbers than central Maine, coastal Maine, and along southern Maine. So it is a statewide issue, but there is kind of this gradient of population size north to south. Now, the common question that comes along with that range expansion and population increase is why. And as humans, just our general human nature is we want this silver bullet reason that we can point to and say, this is what caused this expansion, and if we can just focus on that and eliminate that, then we can eliminate the ticks as well. And unfortunately, there really is no silver bullet answer as to how they were able to expand. It's kind of this confluence of multiple factors. So human activity in particular, if you look at the way that we've used the land over the last couple hundred years, particularly here in New England, a lot of land was originally cleared for agriculture. So all those open agricultural fields, a lot of sunlight getting in, it's not good habitat for ticks. Then over the last 100 years, the last 30, 40 years in particular, Maine has gone to a much more forested state. New England as a whole has really increased its forest size. So we've really created, we've reverted back to, kind of prime habitat, and then mix into that human development. So, we've kind of put in human developments throughout these forested landscapes and kind of fragmented them and created really prime habitat for the host, the small mammals, the deer. We've eliminated and reduced numbers of some of the predators of those species. So those types of factors all can play a role in increasing the tick population and allowing them to move further and further north. And then, of course, you throw in climate, and that has also allowed the tick to expand its geographic range as well. If we're seeing warmer winters, shorter winters, things like that, then deer ticks are able to survive further and further north, and thus expand their range even more so. So it is kind of this multi-factor thing rather than just one kind of silver bullet thing we can look at. So in the United States, there are 18 tick-borne pathogens that have been identified and are known to cause at least 13 different infectious diseases. And that said, researchers and medical personnel continue to find and identify new tick-borne pathogens all the time. Here in Maine, as Bea mentioned, we know of at least 5 that are occurring here, and that we have reported human cases. Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, babesiosis are kind of the big 3. Borrelia miyamotoi disease, also sometimes referred to as Borrelia miyamotoi relapsing fever, and then Powassan virus as well. And so these 5 pathogens are of course, kind of mirror the geographic distribution of their vector, the deer tick. And part of what we were doing with our testing program is trying to get an idea of just the prevalence of infection of some of these pathogens in tick populations here in Maine. So what we found from testing last year, 2019, which was our first year offering the testing service, was that 45% of the deer ticks that we tested were positive for at least one of the pathogens that we tested for, which were the causative agents of Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis. That infection rate certainly differs between adult ticks and the nymphal ticks, and you can understand why, in that the adult ticks have had an added opportunity to feed on a potentially infected animal. We did see also a relatively high rate, 7% co-infection rate. So 7% of the ticks that we tested had a combination, some combination of the 3 pathogens for which we were testing. So just kind of to get more of a geographic breakdown of that information, these are just kind of some spot maps of where each one of those positive tests originated. So you can see the test on the left is for Borrelia burgdorferi, the causative agent of Lyme. And you can really see, the mid-coast and down through southern Maine, we were seeing really high numbers of positive tick samples. And then kind of the same pattern for anaplasma and babesia in that middle and right map. So as far as tick management goes, tick management can be particularly challenging. Again, we always want to point to one of these silver bullet solutions where we can say, if we do this one thing, if we spray this one spray, it's going to eliminate the ticks around the home landscape, and we can just kind of go on about our business and move on with a tick-free life. And unfortunately, that's again not the case. It really takes kind of an integrated approach where you combine multiple strategies to try to minimize the number of ticks on the landscape and minimize your exposure to tick-borne disease as a whole. So kind of by combining the strategies shown here, you can certainly see a reduction in the number of ticks, and you can really minimize that contact. It all starts certainly with personal protection. Bea went over a lot of this personal protection, but I think it's really important, so I'm going to kind of reiterate what she was saying to some extent. Kind of the first part is just simple avoidance. So avoiding tick-infested areas, those areas the habitat that we talked about, wooded areas, places with a lot of leaf litter, edge habitat, trying to avoid, brushing against the vegetation, walking on cleared paths, even planning your activities for the hottest, driest part of the day when ticks are a little bit less likely to be active. The chart on the right is just a breakdown of what people were doing when they picked up the ticks that they submitted to our lab last year. And what you'll see a lot in regards to a lot of these submissions is that it was doing things around the yard, not necessarily out, in large forest tracts, hiking, hunting, fishing. It was doing kind of the mundane things around the home, yard work, gardening, just playing outside, just going for a quick walk. So things like that around the home is where people tended to pick up the ticks, not necessarily when they were, bushwhacking through, forested landscapes. So another thing to consider is taking some of these precautions, not just when you're going on a hike, but when you're going out to the compost pile or you're going out to the garden. So certainly protective measures need to be planned for and taken in those situations as well. Now, as Bea mentioned, one of the most effective ways to minimize contact with ticks is by creating a barrier. Now, this can be done in one of two ways. It can be a physical barrier where you wear clothing, long sleeve, long pants, light colored clothing to make the ticks more easily seen on the clothing, tucking your shirt into your pants, tucking pants into socks. Of course, not a particularly fashionable statement, but something that's going to create a barrier and really try to prevent the ticks from accessing the skin. Now, of course, that barrier can also be a chemical barrier by the use of repellents. So as Bea mentioned, these repellents are the 4 repellents that are recommended by both CDC and EPA based on their efficacy against ticks and other biting pests. DEET, certainly far and away the most common repellent on the market. It's been available for 75, 80 years. There have been some concerns around health of long-term exposure to DEET, but given as long as it's been on the market and the sheer number of applications over that time, it does have a relatively good health record. Now, of course, that said, it certainly does have kind of this greasy feel and chemical smell. It is a solvent, so if you get it on certain materials, it can dissolve them and damage them. So getting it on clothing can be problematic. But it is an effective repellent that offers somewhere in the 4 to 8 hour range of repellents based on the concentration. Picaridin is another highly effective repellent. Again, about 4 to 8 hours of repellent activity. Unlike DEET, it doesn't have some of those kind of off-putting features. It's not greasy. It doesn't have that chemical feel. So it's becoming another really popular type of repellent as well. IR 3535 and oil of lemon eucalyptus, again, both good active repellents, good efficacy. However, they tend to be effective for much shorter periods of time than DEET and picaridin, whereas you're getting potentially 4 to 8 hours of protection with DEET or picaridin. IR 3535 and oil of lemon eucalyptus tend to be maybe half that. People often will point to oil of lemon eucalyptus as a good, natural choice, seeing that it's a natural oil. In reality, what you'll generally see on the actual label for oil of lemon eucalyptus products is something called PMD, which is a lab-derived version. So it's not technically a natural product. So just another thing to be aware of when making repellent decisions. And as Bea said, permethrin is probably the most effective tick repellent available. It is for use on clothing, shoes, and gear, not for use on skin. That often gives people pause. I can use it on my clothes, but I can't get it on my skin. What sort of health issues am I looking at here? And the University of Rhode Island has a calculator on their website where you can punch in your height and your weight, and it'll tell you how many layers of permethrin-treated clothing you would need to be wearing at the same time to reach the minimum threshold of potential toxicity for permethrin. And for your average adult male, 5'9", 175 pounds, it's over 2,000 articles of permethrin-treated clothing worn at the same time to reach that level. So we never by any means say any type of pesticide or chemical is safe, but there are different levels of risk, and this does seem to be a relatively low risk option. And as Bea mentioned, it is also a contact insecticide or a acaricide that will actually kill the ticks if they do happen to not be repelled quickly and stay on the clothing or gear for too long. Now, there are a whole host of other repellents available. You'll often see citronella products. they offer minimal, if any, repellents to mosquitoes. They don't work at all really for ticks, so I would recommend against using citronella products for tick control. Essential oils are becoming particularly popular. Unfortunately, there's really not a lot of information on how well they work and how safe they are. So it's kind of anyone's guess. The small number of studies that have been done on their efficacy have shown that if they do offer any repellent activity, it's for very short periods of time, rather than the several hours of repellents you're getting with some of those EPA recommended repellents. With these essential oil products, it's kind of less than an hour and as low as 15 to 30 minutes. So something to consider if using those. I'm not trying to talk anyone out of using them, but just be aware that the efficacy and active time might be lower, and you may have to reapply much more frequently. Now again, B mentioned the conducting tick checks, but it really is one of the kind of cultural shifts that we need to make here in Maine and in New England as a whole. In other parts of the country, doing a tick check after you come in from outdoors is just common sense and just a common cultural practice, where it's not something that most people that grew up in New England ever thought about doing or even considered doing. But it is something that we need to make that cultural shift and kind of teach future generations now that it is something that needs to take place. Again, showering when you get indoors will help remove any unattached ticks. As B mentioned, popping the clothes in the hot dryer for 10-15 minutes on high heat will kill any of the ticks on those clothes. In conducting that tick check, there are certain parts of the body that are hot spots, as B mentioned as well. This was just a graphic that we put together based on the survey data from the submissions from 2019. As you can see, the attachment sites for ticks were somewhat uniform across the body, across all ages, but when we kind of break it down by age group and look at adults versus children, we do see some differences. Whereas on adults, the attachment site was much more frequently the legs, whereas children under the age of 15, the attachment site was often the head or neck area. And that really makes sense when you think about it. As I mentioned, those ticks are questing waist height and below. So that's adult waist height and below. So of course, they're going to get on the legs first, and will often just attach quickly when they do get on the body. Whereas a small child, that questing height might actually be head or shoulder height, and so that's where the ticks find themselves on a small child. So it certainly makes sense from that perspective, that kind of difference between children and adults. Again, there are a number of folk remedies for removing ticks. You will see all sorts of different methods espoused on the internet, on social media, anything from burning them with a lit match to putting petroleum jelly or dish soap, things like that, and harassing the tick in this way, agitating it can really potentially cause the tick to regurgitate some of the gut contents into the wound, which is something we certainly want to avoid. So just a pair of fine tip tweezers, pulling straight out. You don't want to twist or jerk the tick in any way. Now that said, if the tick does break and the mouth parts are left behind, it is not nearly as big a concern as was once thought. There was a lot of concern that by leaving those mouth parts behind, we were going to see an increased chance of disease transmission. Newer research has shown that's really not the case. While we still want to see that tick removed intact, if the mouth parts do break off, the body basically will treat it like a splinter and expel it on its own. The issue we were seeing was that people were really going to some extreme lengths to try and get those mouth parts out, taking knives and scalpels and really doing a lot of damage around the bite site trying to remove those. So again, as we want the tick intact, but if it does happen to lose the mouth parts, it's not a huge concern. Again, there's a whole host of different types of removal devices on the market. We've found these tick spoons work relatively well, but they are just one of many tick removal devices that are available. Some certainly work better than others. Pets are another consideration. They're part of personal protection. We want our pets to be safe, to be healthy. So this includes conducting those tick checks on them, trying to reduce the tick habitat around the areas where our dogs and cats recreate outdoors or go to the bathroom outdoors. Talking with the veterinarian about available vaccines and available acaricides that can be used on the animals. I would be really cautious about cats. Cats in particular are very sensitive to a lot of chemicals. So there are a lot of chemicals that can be used for dogs that can be have really serious health consequences if used on cats. The infection of Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases also is a little bit different for dogs and cats. Dogs are certainly susceptible to Lyme disease. They can get ill. It can cause serious illness, and it can be fatal for dogs. With cats, they actually seem to be, for the most part, asymptomatic for Lyme disease. That said, there are other tick-borne illnesses that can affect cats. So certainly something to think of for their own health, as well as be mentioned for preventing them from bringing ticks into the home and potentially getting them on us or on children. Now, as far as moving from ourselves to managing ticks in the landscape, the first step is just kind of simply being tick aware. And that's kind of an understanding of whether ticks are being found in your town, in your county, in your neighborhood, kind of monitoring some of those favored hosts. So if you're seeing lots of deer, if you're seeing lots of small mammals, rodents, things like that, then chances are good that you're going to have ticks around as well. There's also something called a tick drag that can be performed. It's a relatively simple activity that's used by researchers to collect ticks. It involves simply dragging a kind of a square piece of white cloth attached to basically a broom handle through the vegetation and just periodically checking if any ticks attach to it. You can then collect those ticks and have them identified, have them tested to really get an understanding of kind of what type of risk you're dealing with on the property. Once you're aware of the problem, certain landscape modifications can be made to try to reduce the habitat and just make the home landscape less hospitable for ticks. So keeping lawns mowed, keeping the grass mowed relatively short, letting in as much sunlight as possible to kind of keep things hot and dry, clearing leaf litter, tall grass, removing brush piles, places that are going to be home to small animals and things like that. As I said, kind of trimming things back to let in as much sunlight as possible really will go a long way. The leaf litter in particular is important. Leaf litter is used by the ticks basically year-round. During the spring, summer, and fall, they use the leaf litter to kind of get out of some of that heat and try to reabsorb some moisture to prevent drying out. It also provides an insulating layer during the winter in addition to the snowpack that will help them survive the cold winter months. So removing as much of that leaf litter as possible really can go a long way to reducing tick populations around the home. Invasive plants are another consideration. Japanese barberry in particular is a really common landscape plant that is actually, fortunately, no longer allowed to be sold in Maine. It's also highly invasive. You can see this picture on the right shows just some of the dense thickets that are created when barberry invades woodlands. Within these barberry thickets, the relative humidity is extremely high, so it's very humid. It really provides a lot of dense cover both for the ticks and their small mammal hosts. Deer and other wildlife don't tend to browse on it, so it really easily takes over. It really provides just kind of the ideal habitat for both ticks and their hosts. So kind of minimizing the use of certain invasives, and if you have those in your landscape, removing them is really a good step in the right direction for minimizing tick exposure. Bird feeders are another consideration. You know, it's great that people want to see wildlife in the yard and want to, you know, kind of help wildlife in any way they can. That said, you know, in addition to the birds that you're feeding, you're also feeding mice and chipmunks and other primary hosts for ticks. So either removing the bird feeders altogether, or at the very least kind of putting them in open areas away from the home is recommended. Same thing for you know, playgrounds and play sets, swing sets, even picnic tables, things like that. Kind of having them out in the open, away from the edge of the landscape is ideal. To kind of just put some distance between yourselves and tick habitat itself. Also, a recommended practice is installing kind of a barrier along the perimeter of the landscape. So just kind of a barrier of wood chips or gravel, 2 to 3 feet wide along that kind of forested edge, will help prevent ticks kind of from moving out into the lawn. And it'll also kind of provide a visual barrier for people, you know, once you're kind of crossing that line into tick habitat. So a little barrier like that can also be helpful in modifying the landscape to make it a little bit less hospitable for ticks. Of course, there is the option of pesticide use for controlling ticks. Pesticide use is highly effective, particularly when used with some of these other management strategies. There are kind of a couple ways of going about using chemical control. One being targeting the habitat, so kind of identifying where ticks are likely to be found in the landscape and spraying those areas. There's also host-targeted chemical controls, where you're actually putting out things like rodent bait boxes, where the rather than, you know, killing the mice or chipmunks, they actually go in and get treated themselves, and it kills any of the ticks that are on the animals. Similar idea for something called tick tubes. It basically looks like a small toilet paper tube that's been stuffed full of permethrin-treated cotton. These are then placed around the landscape in hopes that small animals will use them as nesting material, and in doing so will treat themselves and kill any of the ticks on the animal's body. So there's a few different options for pesticide use in regards to controlling ticks. Now, there has been some interest in using botanicals and, you know, some of those essential oils on the landscape as well. Again, these are exempt from federal registration. They're exempt from the toxicity testing and carcinogen testing that other conventional pesticides go through. So some of the health-related issues are unknown. Some of the botanicals, you know, garlic oil, rosemary oil, and some of the types of some of the really specific types of cedar oil have shown some efficacy in controlling ticks on the landscape, but certainly not nearly as effective as those conventional pesticides, unfortunately. Now, beyond the chemical controls, certainly some people are kind of averse to the use of pesticides as a principle. So looking into biological controls is something that's gotten a lot of attention. You'll often hear recommendations regarding the use of chickens or guinea fowl to, you know, eat ticks off of the landscape. Unfortunately, you know, there hasn't been a lot of research done on their efficacy, but the small amount that has been done has shown that they tend to not be particularly effective at doing this. And it's partially because they're kind of these generalist feeders as well. They're feeding on just about anything that's out there. Will they eat the occasional tick that they stumble upon? Certainly. But you really need something that's really targeting ticks and only ticks to reduce the population. It's just not something that chickens or guinea fowl are doing. So, you know, if it's a really, really small area you're trying to control the ticks in, you know, a really tiny yard, and you have a half dozen of these birds, then maybe it'll be helpful. But, you know, on a larger yard or larger property, unfortunately, they're probably not going to be an effective option. They have looked at host reduction, so kind of deer management in particular has been tried, particularly along some of the coastal islands here in Maine, trying to reduce deer numbers down to kind of the 8 to 13 deer per square mile, or in some instances actually eradicating deer from those islands to evaluate whether that's an effective strategy for minimizing ticks or reducing ticks in that habitat, and it has shown to be effective in those areas. Whether it's applicable to mainland Maine is unknown, but certainly has shown some promise on the islands. Probably the most promising of the biological controls is the pathogenic fungi. It is already currently commercially available in both a spray and a granular form that you can use almost like you would any other pesticide, but rather than a conventional chemical, it uses this fungi on the landscape, which then gets into the tick and kind of eats it from the inside out, and can offer some fairly good protection that way. It is a relatively expensive control method, so, and it tends to not be as available, if you go to your big box stores, your local hardware store, so you might have to kind of scour the internet for some of those products, but it is available as well. Now, a lot of this information that I've gone over is available on our website at ticks.umaine.edu. This is also the website you can go to if you are interested in submitting a tick for identification or testing. So I certainly would encourage you to kind of check that out. And from there, I will stop sharing and take any questions you guys might have.
Okay, we do have some questions, but while I pull up the questions, I'm going to go to the second poll. And so as you're responding to the questions, maybe people can respond to the poll. One of them was, does diatomaceous earth reduce ticks to work to deter ticks?
Yeah, so diatomaceous earth is tough because it's one of those things you're basically just kind of sprinkling it in the landscape. So, unless you have a really small and specific area that you're targeting, diatomaceous earth is probably not going to be terribly effective. I mean, it relies on the ticks kind of crawling across the material, and in doing so, it scrapes up the cuticle of the tick, and basically it just kind of tears the tick apart because of how rough the product is. So the ticks aren't really moving horizontally around a whole lot in the vegetation. They kind of move up and down in the vegetation to quest, but they're not really going horizontally that much, so the chances of them traveling across it are relatively low, so it's probably not going to be worth the cost of applying it.
Here's an interesting question. Do ticks have any significant positive role in the ecosystem? Are they a significant food source for any organism? Or are they parasites without any positive role?
Yeah, I've had this question a lot, both about ticks and mosquitoes. And with mosquitoes, you can really pinpoint their kind of position in the food chain. They are food for a number of aquatic organisms, bats, a whole host of organisms that feed on mosquitoes. Ticks, it's really a lot harder to pinpoint that ecological niche that they're playing beyond just being a blood-sucking parasite. Unfortunately, there's not anything here that's specifically feeding on them or relying on them as a dietary necessity. So I think, I hate to advocate for the eradication of a species, but I think if we were to eradicate the deer tick, it probably would have minimal negative effect on the ecological systems in which it resides.
Have ticks always been here, or are they a modern phenomenon? Either you or Griffin.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, partly what we think is happening is that it might be a recolonization of their historical range, that through human factors, whether it have been that kind of clearing of the land that I talked about, or widespread pesticide use, things like that may have really kind of narrowed their range really significantly and allowed them only to exist in certain pockets previously. Some of those things have now changed, and that's kind of allowed them to recolonize areas that they probably once were, or kind of extirpated from previously. So I think that's probably the case, that they were here once, they were removed, whether not necessarily on purpose, but were removed through other human activity, and then have now been able to kind of recolonize.
Yeah. And one more question, do male ticks feed on people?
Yeah, it's a good question. So male ticks will feed on people, but they don't become engorged like the females do. So the females are the only ones that will actually kind of swell and continuously feed for days at a time. The male ticks, they will attach, they will take very small blood meals occasionally, but they just the morphology of their body, they cannot expand like the females can. So their blood meals are very short in duration. And for that reason, they tend to play a limited, if any, role in the disease transmission cycles.
Do we have European fire ants also? Do they feed on ticks?
Yeah, so we do have European fire ants, particularly along the coast, Acadia, around MDI. There are some significant infestations of fire ants there. That said, it's also a significant kind of hotbed for tick activity. So I don't think that the fire ants are playing a significant role in limiting the ticks in any way, unfortunately. I'm certainly, even if they were, I don't think I would advocate for a widespread release of fire ants across the state either. Unfortunately, I don't think they're playing much of a role in reducing numbers, certainly at least in Acadia and on MDI.
And thank you again, and thank you for being there. We're just a few minutes late, but appreciate your time again, and appreciate all of our audience who was able to tune in, and hope we have been helpful to you today.